a company called Cyberhaven, and they came up with a report for end of 2026, and they said that 83.8% of enterprise AI data comes from unsecured platforms.
Wow.
71.7% of AI tools in workplaces are rated high or critical risk. And 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 so and on currently on the dark web is 225,000 ChatGPT credentials for sale. And then
Wow.
in 2025, there's 34.8% of corporate data that is sensitive that's sitting in these public AI tools.
Oh, today, everybody, I have Ljupka Schwantes with me on the AI Diaries. How are you? Thanks for
I'm
joining
doing
me.
doing great. I'm so excited to be here.
Tell me a little bit about you, what your role is, a little bit about your background, and we can go from there.
Yeah, so during the day, I work as an e-discovery project manager at a law firm called Armstrong Teasdale. And at night, I'm an aspiring legal AI educator, strategist, and speaker, mostly locally here in Kansas City. But sometimes I get opportunities like this where I go and speak on podcasts as well.
Well, and so a mutual connection of ours connected us because he knew I was doing this. He's part of the Kansas City AI Association. And he had said, you really have to meet this woman because she specializes in the legal side of AI and the repercussions. And what's interesting to me, so being in the customer experience space, we're dealing with customer data all the time. And so
Mhm.
sometimes that's anything from healthcare customer or patients to, retail customers. And I think
Mhm.
that a lot of what's not being talked about or not even being understood or
Mhm.
uncovered is the legal side of things. So I'm excited to dive in with you. And I know that some of your perspective is so unique. So thanks again. I
Thank
like
you.
to start off I like to start off with the question. So, you've watched companies adopt new technologies
Mhm.
from a legal and compliance standpoint for years. Are you seeing any of the similar patterns with AI? Um, or is this one actually different altogether?
AI is definitely different altogether. With the advent of AI, ever since ChatGPT came out, I think it was like the end of 2022, um, any technology in the legal space has been lawyers are very reticent to adopt new technologies usually. And so like even in the e-discovery space that I'm in, and e-discovery simply means it's an area of law that deals with how you handle electronic evidence in cases. So these are software platforms that lawyers use to review very large amounts of data. And in the e-discovery space, there's been innovation, but that innovation from an AI standpoint was very slow to adapt and develop. With the advent of AI, what I'm noticing, especially in the legal space, is there's this tension between, for smaller law firms uh, they're finally having the opportunity to adopt some technologies that used to cost thousands and thousands of dollars. So there is a much easier there's not as many barriers to entry from a cost perspective. And then for larger law firms like where I work at, there's a lot of tension between AI adoption and change management. So yes, we
Right.
want to implement AI tools, but when the larger the organization is, the more you're dealing with resistance from everyone who is on those teams that needs to adopt these AI tools. So there's definitely, again, from a small law firm perspective, a push to adopt everything and move quickly. And
Yeah.
then from a larger law firm perspective, that change management that really hasn't been figured out yet.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up because, change management is something that comes up in conversations, but especially on the AI diaries all the time as something that people are struggling with or not thinking about. And I asked somebody the other day, what is one thing on, she did an RFP and sent it to like 15 vendors. And I said, what's the one thing that none of them could answer, or what did they struggle with talking about? And it was change management. It wasn't part of the AI solution. It wasn't part of, the structure of rollout. And so that's interesting that you bring that up. And it's so different with a large organization. If you don't get buy-in, you're buying a tool that nobody's using, but you're paying for.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, so I want to dive in a little bit to, you and I had talked a little bit about a Russian roulette style presentation that you did, and some of the stories I know that people have heard in the news, and even in 2022, 23, 24, and then now. So tell me a little bit about, people trust AI quite a bit. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that it feels like you're talking to another human, or it's conversational. It's not just a standard, uniform output. ChatGPT gave a lawyer a fake case, citations, and he submitted them to a federal court. What does that tell us about how humans are wired to interact with these tools?
So the interesting part about that specific case with the AI hallucination, that happened back in 2023. And that was the first case that came out. It's called Mata versus Avianca. Since then, I actually pulled some stats for today's call. There's been 1,200 global cases, and there's a tracker for AI hallucinations. In Q1 of 2026 alone, there was $145,000 in fines for lawyers. So even again, if we take an industry that is notoriously risk averse, and when we were talking about this idea of adoption, even for lawyers whose brain is trained to look for the risks, even they are getting caught in this kind of web of trust, right? And so I think what is telling us is that the way that I interpret all of this is that our brains have not evolved with adapting to these technologies, right? The algorithms are so incredibly powerful, and they're made now to be so hyper personalized that we start living in this kind of bubble of everything that comes to us. It actually reinforces our thoughts, our thinking, our biases. And so it makes it it's an artificial trustworthiness, right? It makes it feel like, because it's all of the information that we're receiving back from an algorithm, whether that's a chat log or a program, it's reinforcing our beliefs, which is increasing that trust, which is, again, a fake trust, right?
Yeah.
And so in the legal space, the interesting thing that's happening is that there's a big tension between, again, this idea of developing and trusting tools, but ultimately the responsibility lies in the lawyer license for the lawyer who's using that tool. So the courts have very swiftly replied with not just fines, but sometimes, suspensions of bar licenses. And so they're saying, okay, pause and think about the fact that the responsibility ultimately lies with the lawyer, because when they obtain that license, they sign, they have ABA professional code of conducts that they have to follow. And they have a duty of competence. They have a duty of confidentiality. So all of these things are ultimately going back to the responsibility of the lawyer who's using those AI tools.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can't be like, well, it's the vendor's fault. It's the tool's fault. I mean, nobody told the lawyer that they had to use that tool. That was a choice that they made. That's so interesting. And you touched on biases, which I think is not talked about enough when it comes to AI and these different tools. Where do you see AI biases showing up and potentially being problematic for companies?
Yeah, so there are plenty of different cases, and the biases are usually happening. I do have to point out very clearly that most of the time the biases are happening in that AI orchestration tool portion. So when you have data that is the first layer of how an AI tool or an LLM tool is built, if that specific data is already biased, then the tool itself will be biased. So the tool is just following the instructions of whatever your training data is. So the biases on first level happen in that training data. One example of that is, this was way back in 2018. Amazon had to scrape an ATS tracking system or an application tool internally that they created, because they noticed that it was discriminating against women. Why? Because most of the applications that were coming in for software developers and engineers were male of certain age, right? And so like they had to scrape an entire tool because the training data on that first level was already biased. And so that's, one level of bias. The other level of bias that we see is, again, in this idea of trusting the tool too much without that layer of double checking. There are certain tools out there like Perplexity where it will actually show you and those are the tools that I usually recommend people to use, that will actually show you the links of where it pulled that information from. And so the bias again comes in place of when you're actually trusting the tool too much, right? But I would say majority of where bias starts is in that training data level, in that first level of like when you're building out the tool.
Right, right. And what would you say, what's like, and I'm sure that there's multiple ways and best practices, but what is the one thing that you must do on that orchestration level to be mindful or prevent bias as much as you can?
I think there are certain things that the issue with companies who are creating these tools is that when they are gathering their committees on like who should be on this committee to create this tool, they should not only have software developers on that team. They need to have a team of ethicists. They need to have a team of people who potentially could be affected negatively by that tool.
Wow.
So we're not only talking about, like, a lot of times these large language models, are created by data scientists, software developers. Can we look at, the kind of the framework that they're using and who are they advising in order to create these tools, right? So that's the gap that I see personally is, are we paying attention to ethics? Are we paying attention to, again, who is this tool? But are we creating an analysis of who this tool potentially could negatively affect? And are we including those people into selecting the training data, working through how we orchestrate this tool?
So you're saying companies do that right now, or are you saying when they start doing it the right way, that's how they will or should do it?
Yes, I mean there's companies that are doing both. There's companies that are not paying attention to that, but there's absolutely companies that are doing it the right way and are including those people from the get-go.
Yeah, because I mean, we always talk about like the foundation that you make is what everything's going to be built on. So if you have a messy foundation, it's going to be much harder to fix this later on. And by that point, you're probably in a legal case, and nobody's going to be. You can't just be like, oh shoot, next time we'll do it better. Sorry guys, you've got to think about these things, especially for really large companies that have so many different people or eyes on them and people that they are employing and are being affected by this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So another question I like to ask is the gap between expectations and reality. I think everybody kind of has an idea of that when they think about it. But, you being on the litigation side, you see the aftermath of what happens when expectations are not reality. So what is the most common way, and you kind of already touched on it, but that companies get themselves in trouble with AI tools?
So I have another set of stats that I can point to. There's a company called Cyberhaven, and they came up with a report for end of 2020 2006, and they said that 83.8% of enterprise AI data comes from unsecured platforms.
Wow.
71.7% of AI tools in workplaces are rated high or critical risk. And 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 so and on currently on the dark web is 225,000 ChatGPT credentials for sale. And then
Wow.
in 2025, there's 34.8% of corporate data that is sensitive that's sitting in these public AI tools. And so
Wow.
what I can tell you where companies are really the gap that I'm seeing is that companies are finally starting to put together AI policies and AI governance and AI frameworks, and they're having their employees sign these policies, but there's absolutely zero compliance tools out there to actually keep of track of whether their employees are following these policies. And so what is happening in companies is, and there's different reasons why employees do this, but there's so much of what we call shadow use of AI. And I can tell you that's probably the number one problem for large companies that need to tackle, companies in general that need to tackle right now, is that shadow use. How do we find it? Can we keep track of it? How do we, address it with our employees? So in the
Yeah.
same way that we have cybersecurity trainings for phishing and things like that, that companies have
Yeah.
implemented and employees sign those policies, there's not really currently a lot of that AI kind of governance. Again, there might be trainings, there might be policies, but there's not really compliance tools that address what happens when an employee
Yeah.
actually goes to a public ChatGPT platform or something like that and uses company data. One example I can give you is for Samsung company, the CEO asked their assistant to like summarize their notes, and that went into like it was like a company, company like
Yeah.
confidential meeting, and those notes went into a public platform, right? And then same thing with Samsung, software developers are taking company code and they're putting it into whether it's Claude code, just to check and make sure that they're doing their code right,
Yeah.
or is like, debugging a code. And so
Wow.
again, you're taking company code, you're putting it into a public platform. That's a pretty big deal, right? Like that's a pretty
A
big
huge
problem.
deal.
And the issue is, again, sometimes, employees are smart. They will not use the company laptop to go into a ChatGPT public platform. They'll take that information and use their phone,
Is
right?
that what shadow use is?
Yes, absolutely. So there's shadow use where like you can track it, right, in the company system because you have audit logs of what employees are
Yeah.
doing that you can, again, go back to and refer to. But look, what do you do with shadow use of AI with employees who are using their personal devices for AI searching while
Okay.
using company data?
Wow. So shadow use, and I've heard that before, but in case people don't know, that's using company data on a unapproved platform. You're basically, it would be exactly what you just said. Somebody using call notes, proprietary,
Mhm.
confidential call notes and putting it into their own chat GPT or something.
Yep,
Oh my gosh, that's crazy. That's like
yep.
taking call notes and just putting it on a, newscast. I mean, it's worse because it's actually stored somewhere, but wow.
But the interesting thing and why it's happening is there's this, frankly, what I see cognitive dissonance of leadership in companies where they, on one side, are pushing employees to use AI, be more productive. We're seeing layoffs happening left and right. And yet at the same time, not giving those proper tools to employees, and implementing them properly into their companies. And so employees are kind of feeling squeezed out where they're feeling like they
Yeah.
need to be productive. And so that shadow use oftentimes come out of fear of being laid off, or fear of, again, being next on the chopping block, or fear of not appearing as productive, not being able to meet, company or your boss's expectations. And so like we're going to these tools as a shortcut to, you know, be more productive, right? But then that causes a lot of
Yeah.
privacy and security,
Wow.
issues for companies.
So then what about when So what I'm seeing a lot of in the customer experience and contact center industry is like AI agents and
Mhm.
AI, people actually entirely being replaced with AI, which who knows if that's going to backfire or what the fallout of that will be. But
Mhm.
is that is that more secure than giving AI access to a human employee because you can monitor what the AI agent is doing more, or is
Mhm.
it just has its own risks when it comes to privacy and compliance and data?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because it all depends on where is that agent located, right? And where is that data? So if the data is sequestered within the company system and we're not using a outside vendor like Claude, like, OpenAI to, Azure, like we're not using kind of the data warehousing from an outside source, then yes, it is more private and more secure, and you can kind of contain that, especially when you're talking about in situations where, whether it's HIPAA, CCPA, GDPR, when you're trying to find, follow AI governance frameworks that are put together by various different government bodies. Um, I think the issue and this is, when you were talking about like what is the question that vendors can't answer, I think the
Yeah,
issue is that when you're signing a vendor agreement, usually in there you're doing kind of you have a questionnaire, hopefully, to your vendor. Where is our data residing? And what
yeah,
do you do with that data, right? And who is liable if there's a breach of that data? So you have
yeah,
that layer with the vendor. But then so many vendors, or what they're called now, ChatGPT wrappers, right? So many companies act as wrappers and their data resides somewhere else. So as
yeah,
an end user, when you're buying a vendor product, the question that you should be asking is not just about what happens if the data is breached at the vendor site, but what happens when the data is breached at the place where they house that
yeah,
data. So there's a
yeah.
layer that is missing there, right? Um,
Wow.
yeah, so in, going back to, your question about agents, I think it is possible. Where I see the trend going is companies are finally waking up to this realization that when you have a data privacy and a data security breach, it's usually, very costly in the
Yeah.
millions to have to now report. And so
Wow.
the one way that they're tackling, that data orchestration and capturing that data only locally is to create their own, what they call small language models. So not
Yeah.
go to a large language model to pull, this information, and to actually have that data warehouse locally on their servers. And again, depends on, how large the company is and what their capabilities
Yeah.
are, what their budgets are. Probably the smallest example I can talk about, when it comes to, like, let's say it's a smaller company, is with OpenClaw. So OpenClaw is kind of touted as the new, not standard, but kind of the new shiny thing for data
Yeah.
preservation, where your data does not ever, you don't even have to have internet, right? Like your data never
Yeah.
leaves your whatever computer system you're using, and that makes it more private and more
And
secure.
then what is OpenClaw for people who don't know?
It's gosh, it's complicated to explain. I'll try to explain it. It's pretty much, if you're looking at a model like ChatGPT, it's a large language model that you house, you import your training data into that, system. And that, again, that training data, some people use Mac minis, other people use, different kind of data warehouse, let's call it. And so it's again, it's a localized, if really I can they only describe it as like a small language model that you
Yeah.
build yourself and that you house locally. That's the
Okay.
only way I can describe it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I know that the term OpenClaw is going around, and so, um, that's why I ask. But okay, I want to know okay, so contact center leaders right now are rushing to deploy AI, both because there's, this whole like fear of missing out and also, keeping up with the the Robinsons, what is that? Keeping up with
The
the
Joneses.
Joneses, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they want to be able to do what everybody else is doing. But they're handling real customer data. So
Mm-hmm.
from a data governance and e-discovery standpoint, what happens to all of those conversations if the company ends up in litigation?
They come to me, and so as an e-discovery project manager, I'm the last kind of line of where that data comes. And I can tell you that the biggest challenge that we're having right now in the e-discovery space is, so far when it comes to data collection, we have dealt with very specific quote unquote easy types of data. So when we're collecting data, we're collecting Outlook inboxes, we're collecting Slack messages, we're
Wow.
collecting, we're collecting all this type of data, but that was, we're collecting regular Excel spreadsheets and Word documents and all of that. So the type of data that we were collecting was easy to collect. And we can have an audit trail of where that document, for example, went through.
Yeah.
And that audit trail is usually showed through this concept called metadata. So metadata is data about data. So like if you right now on your computer have a Word document, and if you right click on it and you click on those properties will show when you opened that Word document, when maybe you modified
Right.
it and edited it. So when that document comes to me, all of that metadata goes into like a spreadsheet format that I can see, and we have an audit trail again on, where that data went, like in who touched it, who,
Right.
modified it, and all of that. The problem with AI agents is that who is the owner of that data? Where does the liability lie? And we're frankly still through the court system trying to decide that.
Yeah.
And it's different based on the types of data. So if you have an agent who is autonomous and who is responsible for making those autonomous decisions, when something goes wrong, that audit trail is not going to show, number one, who actually authorized that, that action. But it goes even deeper and it gets even more complicated because agents work in what's called like a black box environment. So like in that
Yeah.
black box environment, a large language model, you cannot get to that bottom layer of source code of how did this agent make that decision, right?
Right.
And so like when you're talking about looking at that metadata and how an autonomous agent makes those decisions, there's genuinely not been a single case where we can address where does the liability lie outside of like the orchestrator of these agents, right? Like
Wow.
that's kind of the layer where we're at right now. But when you're having systems executing tasks autonomously, it's really hard to have that audit trail to get to who is responsible, like who is liable for that
Yeah.
decision when it's a decision that has caused a certain lawsuit.
Wow. And so you're kind of making up the playbook as you go, everybody in the legal space.
Yes. And it's again, it's been something that's been really challenging in a lot of the, recent I mean, we're still dealing with it's interesting because like the last e-discovery conference that I went to, we're still dealing with how to address what we call modern attachments. So like we have document management systems now where they're not housed on our computers, right? They're housed on the cloud. And so
Yeah.
let's say in the legal space, when you have a pleading that you're trying to revise multiple times, you have multiple versions of that document. And sometimes in litigation, version number 1 is more important than version number 10. But because someone sent you a link to that specific document in the document management system, how do you get back to that version of that document
Yeah.
that is important in this case, right? And so we're still dealing with trying to tackle a technology that's
Yeah.
been around. How do we address that maybe for 10 years now or maybe longer, right?
Yeah.
And so even trying to think about addressing electronic evidence that came from an agent that was orchestrated into this
Yeah.
system, we are way behind. We are way behind.
Wow. Wow. And what was the number? You said 1,200 cases of have been in the since 2018, you said? Or no, just in the
No,
last year?
2023. So since 2023, there's been 1,200 cases, but those are cases only strictly specifically to AI hallucinations
Hallucinations.
from a
Yeah.
legal research perspective, where a lawyer found a case that they thought
Oh,
was a
yeah.
real case, and then submitted it in a pleading, and then through the case discovery or through the disclosure process, it was found that that case was actually fabricated, that it was fabricated by an AI tool. So yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so that's just a small piece of.
subset.
All right, so I like to end with a question that you made an entire presentation about, basically, which is really fascinating. I call it the warning label question. So if you could put a warning label on AI that you would never see in a vendor deck or in a sales pitch, what would that be?
So there's two different types of vendor labels. One, I would say from a personal perspective, like I'm using AI as a personal user, right? Not as a company. And then I can speak about like what the warning label would be for a company. So for an individual person, the warning label should be everything that you put into a chat GPT or any type of LLM model, especially if it's a public model, it's a free model that you did not pay for, so you don't have an enterprise account. Understand that that data is there and it's residing forever. It can be used against you from what's called a social engineering perspective, meaning if you put your address, if you put your information, a hacker can go into that, let's say ChatGPT model, and then can use that against you in a form of fraud, meaning they can
Yeah.
call you, they can even it goes even as far as like if you have an audio of your voice, that voice can
Wow.
then be used against you to call your grandma, say that you're in jail and that that you need
Oh my
help.
gosh.
And so any information that you put into a public, chat forum that, especially on a free trial, free account, understand that that is all kept forever. There is a specific case that actually came out this year that I'll explain really quickly. A certain company founder was trying to scam his two co-founders in a specific contract that they were putting together that turned out into a $250 million dispute. And so he claimed that he deleted those chat logs, and his co-founders went directly to OpenAI, were able to have a subpoena to OpenAI to obtain those chat logs that then showed his
Wow.
malicious intent. And so again,
That's
even sometimes
crazy.
on an enterprise account level, if you're using an enterprise account level, that information can be,
Yeah.
again, it's called prompts as intent. It can show malicious intent in
Yeah.
court in as evidence.
Wow, that's insane that he did that. Oh my gosh. And then he was saying, so his point, or the point he was trying to make was, I deleted that. You shouldn't be able to get that information.
So on some of the chatbot kind of policies, user policies that they have, it'll say something to the effect of, this data. Let's say you can ChatGPT is a perfect example. You can open a private chat, right? So in a private
Right.
chat, you think that it's private, but
Right.
that information is actually, I think for ChatGPT right now, their retention policy is 30 days. So even though you opened a private chat and you thought it was private, ChatGPT's owned end user policies clearly state that that data
Yeah.
will be preserved for 30 days.
Like an incognito tab
Yes,
style.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So that incognito also will be preserved.
Right. Um,
So
so
that's
that,
from a
yeah, that was
personal
the one
user
warning label.
perspective.
Okay.
Yeah. And then from a company's perspective, probably my number one warning label right now would be to tell companies when they're picking AI vendors to try to negotiate month-to-month models rather than an annual contract, which is
Yeah.
what we're normally used to with vendors, because the technology is so, changes all the time. And the other warning label, again, I'm speaking more of a company trying to evaluate
Yeah.
a vendor, is really to look at where that, like we spoke before, where that data resides and
Yeah.
what is your kind of liability and indemnity clauses that you're putting into your vendor contract to make sure that your company ultimately, if there is a, a data security or a data privacy breach of some sort, like where would that liability lie? And a lot of vendors cannot answer that question, again, because they are themselves using some sort of an LLM model in order when they're actually creating their product. So that would
Yeah.
probably be like the warning label for
Yeah.
companies,
Yeah.
and that's more from like a purchasing perspective. I think when it comes to companies again and employees, I think the warning label should be, okay, we really need to train our employees on how to use AI properly and work on
Yeah.
those training videos, training manuals for employees so that employees don't feel kind of left out, right? They don't feel like
Yeah.
they're kind of in the dark. They're trying to navigate this new AI world by themselves, being pressured to use AI, but not knowing properly how to use AI. And I think for someone like me who's been in this AI space for a long time, what make an assumption that everyone else in the world would know. I think the data came out very recently where I think it was only like, I don't know, 12 to 14% of people in the entire world even know what AI is. And there's like a
Yeah.
really, really small fraction and portion of people who are building tools. There's a very small portion of
Yeah.
people who are using tools. So we should not make an assumption that, just because these tools are coming out, that everyone,
Yeah.
one, knows how to use them, and two, wants to use them, right?
Yeah.
So how do we
Yeah.
address that internally within companies?
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And the stats are really interesting. I have one more question.
Sure.
So we're talking a lot about corporate, and we know that there's a lot going on. Do you think that there's a version of these problems, happening inside corporate that hasn't blown up, or happening inside companies that with using AI to draft contracts and policies and correspondences that hasn't blown up but will?
That's a really good question. I think it can only blow up. Again, I keep going back to that data orchestration, which I think a lot of people are not paying attention to. So I'll strictly speak in a law firm. If I have a new AI product that looks like a very shiny tool and I'm trying to integrate it within the existing tools that I have within my company, within my law firm, if that data is not clean, that is connecting to this new AI tool, then you cannot blame the AI tool for working improperly, right?
Yeah.
So before you even implement any AI tool, create a data map, create an architecture of what are the current tools that my law firm is using right now, my company is using right now. Do we have clean data that we can work off of in order for us to implement this new tool? And then, yes, once we implement this tool, like what are the benchmarks that we have? Like what does success look like? 3 months,
Yeah.
6 months, moving forward. So I think where things can blow up is when you don't do that homework from the beginning. So like you've got to have the basics and the first layer figured out before you can implement an AI tool. Like
Yeah.
what does that data structure and architecture look like in your company first? And do we even, I think oftentimes with the race of implementing AI tools, sometimes we don't need to implement an AI tool.
Yeah.
Like sometimes maybe it's a very simple process that we can tackle without using AI. So can we do that first? And
Yeah.
if we can't, if we really see a problem that only AI can solve, then yes, let's use AI. But not every
Right.
problem in a company is fixed by AI.
And don't use it just to use it, because it can overcomplicate something that wasn't meant to be complicated to begin with.
And like I'll take in a contract management kind of space. Like sometimes you'll have in a law firm where like again, the kind of management is siloed into the different offices that a law firm would have. And so one office uses one contract management tool, another office uses another contract management tool. So it's like there's literally zero overlap and there's no kind of uniformity between what the different offices are using. So if you're trying to bring in yet a new tool, you already don't have that
Yeah.
communication on the first level. So if you're trying to bring new tool that is going to unify, let's say you're deciding to like bring a new AI tool that is going to replace all of the existing, first you're going to have a lot of resistance from the people who are using these tools, because now you're going to have to go through an entire kind of on-ramping and training for the new tool. But second is, what does that data look like in each tool, and can we put it into a brand new AI tool, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I keep going back to that first level of like, figure out where your data resides. Is it, actually transferable to
Yeah.
another system?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you've answered so many questions that I keep getting asked. And so I'm excited, to kind of see where the world of AI goes, and there's more news and questions coming out all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I like to, ask, is there anything you're working on that you're excited about? Any events you'll be at? I know that you're part of the Kansas City AI Association, so
Mm-hmm.
anybody in Kansas City, definitely check out the AI Association if you have not already.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, is there anything else that is on your mind?
I think for me, I don't have any speaking engagements coming up yet, but I do like to give kind of plugs, shameless plugs to the organizations that I'm
Yeah, yeah,
involved in recently. Most recently, where we're seeing a giant gap in people being left behind is women in the AI space. And so some of the organizations that I want to shout out to are the Kansas City Women in Tech. There is the She Leads AI organization. There's Digital Women of KC. Obviously, the Kansas City AI Club that you mentioned yesterday. I was at Data Science KC. So I would like to see more women
yeah,
come into this space, and not just, talk about it, but actually be involved in those decision-making processes. And I
yeah.
think a good way to do that is to network in these organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that the AI Association, if they haven't already, they'll have one in Denver. So they're all over the country.
Yes,
And so,
there's one specifically called the AI Collective that has chapters all over the world, and there is the
okay.
AI Collective in Kansas City. So I'm sure that there's an AI Collective
Yeah,
in Denver as well.
yeah. Okay. Well, this has been amazing. I hope we get the opportunity to meet in person. And I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. This has been lovely. It's been super fun, and I
Yes.
thank you for the opportunity, and good luck with yeah, with it's a super fun and exciting podcast, and I can't wait to hear more episodes.